Morning, morning, monsters. How is everyone doing this morning? I had a bit of a late start. I know, how unusual for me having a bit of a late start. It happens though. The first thing to realize with dreams is when you stamp a shape like this shape is actually made up of two things. If you look at Alex's SIGGRAPH talk, you realize that he talks about a bricks engine and he talks about a splat engine, and we go back and forth and stuff. What we actually ended up with is the bricks engine, or a volumetric system with the splat engine on top. And why is that important in the world of transparency? Well, basically we send out ray casts into the scene to figure out like how to light a pixel. What we do a raycast to find out what the actual ray hits, and then when we hit that thing we light it, and the lighting step is figuring out the color of that pixel is the expensive part. You see how you got outer properties and inner properties. The best way to sort of show this is let me do this white there and then do red there, tint it really strongly. So the outer hull of a shape is made up of flecks like paint strokes, and then the inner hull is made up of a solid shape, and that gives us a few advantages. So this is the thing where you sort of see glow through, and you can see how, depending on how close you are to the object, you see the inner hull more, because the outer hull, we're okay if we miss it. It's a kind of best attempt thing. And the outer hull is where all of the looseness comes from. I don't want to go too in the weeds because Alex's talk goes really nicely into the weeds. Is that if I put two shapes behind each other like this, I can use this first shape to block this shape. Like we can build what's called BVH, bounding volume hierarchy, and we can cast rays in, and we can do early determinations of what it hits, and we can stop it there. When you're in sculpt mode, if you change the fleck type, it changes it for the whole sculpt, and that's because the hole and the flecks are generated for the sculpt. When you're in paint mode, you can literally paint different fleck types next to each other, and that's because paint is basically a user-defined outer hull. It's a user-defined fleck pattern. One of the things you do to help yourself with transparency is you can pre-sort things in your scene next towards the camera, so you know what's in front of the other thing. And that's the way you do proper transparency. Why is paint so much cheaper than sculpts? It's not. It's the dirty secret. And I'll explain why in a sec. When you're doing transparency, one of the things you'll do in a lot of other engines is you'll sort things close to far to the camera, but obviously the camera is always moving, so that sorting order is always changing, so you're having to process through a lot of data. That's a big overhead, like a huge overhead. If you're not sorting things close to far to the camera, then the only way of doing proper transparency is to send a ray through and to figure out to hit everything it could possibly hit, and then do the sorting later in the process. There's a function called Overdraw. So Overdraw is really expensive, and if you've ever done a bunch of stuff with sculpts, and I really need to hasten to add, thermometers have nothing to do with performance. Thermometers are 100% about memory. Thermometers are about memory, they're not about with performance. In some cases, we've loaded memory limits to help performance because these things are tied together, but largely speaking, thermometers are about how many things you can have. I go to test mode and I turn on Overdraw. You see that big glowing orange bit there? That is making the GPU work very, very hard. If I have a nice big dense bush there, you'll notice the thermometer's not crazy high, but you'll notice that the flicker and the performance. You can even hear my PS4 in the background. This is basically because there's so many paintings that it's trying to figure out, because it's trying to do some sorting on those. That camera sorting I talked about. That it becomes really expensive to sort out. Like, you're actually seeing, if I go into analysis mode here, see that graphics cost to shoot up? Even though I haven't really hit the thermometer very hard, the moment I have a bunch of those paintings in scene, and that's what we were warning you about, there is a lot of overdraw going on, right? Now, fortunately, it's quite easy to solve this problem in that I can go into sculpt mode. I can pick that green color. We've actually added things to the scene. We haven't deleted anything. We've added things to the scene, but now I can like look directly into the bushes and there's less damage. I'm showing you a pretty bad use case here. The sculpts are solid. See, at the moment I delete those sculpts, it goes crazy. We know at an earlier stage of the render what we can show and what we don't need to show. It's like how we know when something's behind us, behind the camera. Right, what does this all mean to transparency? Why is transparency such a big issue for this? Well, remember I said earlier we cast rays, we figure out what they hit. After we figure out what they hit, we light the pixel. And light the pixel means figure out what color the thing was you hit and then calculate all the bunch of lights around that'll influence that pixel. Well, how we actually manage this is a system called Stochastic Rendering. And it basically means we roll the dice. You can see the flicker in that render, right? And that's because every single frame we're rolling a dice. What transparency really means when we talk about opacity is we just mean how likely is it, what are your odds of hitting the object, right? So if you're 100% solid, any ray that hits that thing always hits that thing. If you're not very solid at all, then we lower the chance of you hitting that thing, right? Basically what happens is every time we send one of these rays, we roll a dice to figure out whether or not it hits the object, and that dice is affected by the opacity. And I don't know how much this has been picked up on stream, because it's really hard to pick up on stream, and we work very hard to hide this from people, because you know it's considered a rendering artifact. But in stochastic rendering, you've all seen the kind of dithered effect. We send those through, we do our dice rolls, and then we take the previous frames and we blend them in. But we don't just blend them in dumbly. We, at a GPU level, for instance, know this object ID. So if this thing here is animating, we know what is animating, and we can motion blur on it. And things like the sharpen and blur effect are applied later on in the stage. Now, if you want to see how this accumulation effect can work really nicely for you, if we turn camera movement blur up to 100%, you notice the dithering of this stuff here. It becomes a much smoother, nicer transparency. And that's basically just because we're blending it multiple times. But then you notice how anything that moves can sort of ghost, and if I move the camera, it sort of ghosts. So this is lovely for taking photos, but it's terrible for running the game in real time. But think about this another way. You know how this was blurring here? What if I turned the animation speed of this down to 7%? Turn it down to 1%. I want to make the example extreme. So now it just looks really nice, and that doesn't look like a smeared mess because it's moving very slowly as the camera does blur. Thought experiment. What if you had a movie in dreams and you wanted it to look very nice, and you slowed down the animation of the movie, like in Dreams, to 1% playback, and you turn that slider up. You export all the frames. The movie's 100 times longer than you wanted it to be, but then in After Effects or whatever it was, you literally squished the movie down 100 times, and you did that not stupidly. You did that with a good compression thing that uses multiple frames to interpolate. And by the way, most modern video software has this kind of function. What you would get is a high quality version of whatever you did in Dreams. And we don't do it to that extent, but we basically do that hack. That's kind of the hack that we do to make everything look really nice and shiny, and looks pretty. This gives us a whole range of options. It lets us do things that other engines can't do. So like one of my favorite things this lets us do is when we grab, I'm just going to grab a skeleton. I can take this arbitrary shape and I can make it glow. And the glow from this and the lighting in Dreams, this is like one of our superpowers, the lighting. Notice how we can sort of glow through objects. We can illuminate objects, and this glow can be colored, which is a big deal. We're transmitting more information with our lights and stuff, and you can just put a metric ton of these objects around. And yeah, they don't cast shadows, because casting shadows is a whole nother expensive thing. But the reason we can do all of this is because of a lot of the other decisions we've made. They're artistic choices in the engine. The trade-off is we don't really have, the ambient occlusion in Dreams is fantastic, and it really pays off for sculpts and lighting scenes, and I think it's kind of a superpower in Dreams, especially when you can do crazy stuff that some people do. But the trade-off is we don't have transparency at the moment in the way you would describe. I won't go into the ways that we could add transparency. There are methods and means. There's been discussions about it since before Dreams even launched. That dithering effect, or that stochastic render we call it. And if you go on and you look at like Blender's cycle render and other renders, you will see this, if you look for stochastic rendering, you'll see this kind of effect, this dithering effect that I'm talking about here. And as I say, we just do a lot of clever trickery to disguise it. But yeah, the big thing I would say to you is if you are using a lot of things like this, a lot of strokes, and if you are doing that kind of stuff where you're using some of the transparency we do have, you do want to look at your overdraw. And remember, you can actually improve performance, and I'll highlight that again, you can actually improve performance by taking a solid object and hiding it inside your bushes. Because if you take a solid object like that and you hide it in your bushes, okay, the overdraw is so bad there that it's not helping a ton, but let's just see. But it is helping. It's just the overdraw is tweaked to show you this is bad. Yeah, so you see there's the darker spot in the middle of the hot spot, and that's because that the sculpt's in there. So, and I know I always say this, and I just want to remind people about this, the thermometers have nothing to do with performance. They're to do with memory, how many things you can have. Obviously, the more things you have at a scene, the more likely your performance is going to go down, which is why people see high thermometers and they see low performance. There is a correlation there. And for instance, if you have a lot of things in your scene, the game has to work harder at counting and cycling through things and whatnot. But the only real way to find out the performance of your scene is to go into analysis mode, to run through, and as I say, like if I go up to this bush, see that graphics cost just shoot up, and that's, yeah. But now if I go into here, it's actually all okay. And yeah, so now you can go into here and you can go, oh, that was terrible. And yeah, that's how you can figure that stuff out. Could it be possible to let people paint specular maps, different material types on the same sculpt? If I go into here, let me just go out here. I just need to turn up the looseness so this is obvious. If I go out of here and I go into here and I change the fleck type, you notice how it changes for the entire sculpt, and that's because I'm generating the outer hull that we talked about, the inner and outer hull. I'm generating that based on these tweaks and these settings, so the flecks are procedural. And that also applies for things like the waxiness and the metalness. It's one of the reasons why you want to keep objects separate, and the shininess and the roughiness. And that's really what you mean by specular map, really. Now, one of the optimizations we do, or one of the performance benefits we do, is we know that a whole sculpt is of a certain type. So if we were to allow you to set different properties on subparts of the sculpt, all we would really be saying is take these different sculpts together and have sub-sculpts. So for the renderer, it would be the same amount of work. It would be less work for the GPU than for the CPU than say cloning this 3 times and then having it slightly different properties. It's one of those trade-offs. Painting an actual map, or painting it with the same way we paint color, in theory is possible. So yeah, when you come in here and in an earlier version of Dreams, the entire sculpt was one color, just to give you a reference point. But yeah, at the moment you can paint color. So in theory, there's a world in which you could paint metalness or whatever, but that's not currently a thing we support. If you need it, put it in feedback. So, and one of my favorites is actually Impasto. I freaking love Impasto. Impasto is just like, you know, how much they're sticking out, how much depth they have. It's really, Impasto does cool things to flex. I really, really love it. It's one of my favorite fleck tweaks. Let's see. So what people don't realize is our brush flecks, they're not textures, they're actually 3D models. That's really important because when I take a spotlight and I shine it at these flecks here, if I do Impasto nice and thick, so that is a single fleck there, you see, but you notice how the fleck actually has depth in how it's lit by the light. That's because our paint strokes, our flecks, aren't textures. Everyone thinks they're textures. They're 3D models. And because they're 3D models, very, very simple texture 3D models, the simple stuff you paint. Much like when you put paint on canvas. Paint on canvas just has this natural texture. Whereas if I did, even if I'm painting with a felt marker on paper, the pen strokes sort of layer on top of each other to stick out. Whereas if you open Photoshop and you drag and you draw a red square, it's a solid red square. Every pixel is solid red. Because we do this is why lighting matters so much in Dreams. Okay, so one of the things that Martin does really well is he layers up his flecks really well, and he lets the engine just do work for him. So you see like the wear pattern on that door. That's basically just the door stacked on top of the door. He lets the depth of the flecks bring in that texture into the door. He's not hand painting that texture. He's letting these two things fight with the fleck stuff, and that's how he's getting his staining. He does that a lot. Oh, I'm liking oh, that's clever. So you see here what he's done is he's put paint strokes either side of another paint stroke. And then he's used colored paint strokes to give that tinting of sort of faded lead glass. And then, yeah, he's used the text display. Yeah, the text display. I missed that in my chat about transparency. The text display, the reason it has transparency is, let me grab this here. Let me grab a light. Notice the text display doesn't receive light. That's why it has transparency. It does not take on light. And I know people hack a lot with the text displayer, but it can, if we had a lot of objects in the scene that were just unlit, you would lose so much quality in Dreams. The stream that Alex and Liam did was very good in depth, and I highly encourage people to look at that. But I know sometimes people don't inherently get it, so it's always nice to have another explanation of it. We do have some graphics wizards on our team, but we can't make wine from water. You know, still have to follow the laws of physics. I think my favorite bitch and moan about the laws of physics is when people are like, oh, VR is going to go wireless. I'm like, yeah, the moment something's not plugged into a wall, the amount of physics you have to fight with, it gets harder. It gets a lot harder. And now I would say there's a very big difference between a big honking fat off cable and just a little like USB-C cable. But the difference between a USB-C cable and no cable, well, the Oculus Link is a good demonstration of that. If you see what the Oculus Quest 2 can do when it's plugged into a good PC versus when it's not, I think that's a good example. So yeah, physics. I really like, we can do a bunch of witchcraft, but we can only do so much witchcraft. And I hope that helps. Yeah, I hope that really helps explain things. Yeah, the VOD will be there, don't worry. The VOD will be there. In fact, because this is quite a straightforward run through, I think I'll provide this on YouTube as well. So, see you tomorrow, monsters. It won't be Dreams, it'll be something else because tomorrow's Friday. Until then, ta-ta.